Friends, come forward. There you go. I'd be happy to be the microphone person. Yes. Friends, if you can sit forward, there's in the second pew there's room. So if you can come forward, please. The first pews are available as well. It's just better when we feel cozy. Mary, come on forward, please. Thank you. Well, welcome, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Pastor Karen Bodenschatz, and I serve as one of the pastors here alongside Pastor Stanton, who's sitting in the back. And it is my honor and joy to introduce our speaker for today, as soon as she's done passing things out. So Pastor Libby Howe is from the Wisconsin Council of Churches. Most of you know her because she is a member of this congregation, but she works for the Wisconsin Council of Churches as the Congregational Support Coordinator for Peace and Justice Ministries. I invite you to ask her what that means. But what she does and what I've seen her do is work with congregations and congregational leaders on rediscovering their voice for justice and peace, to live out our calling as baptized people of God. And one of the ways that she does that is by helping us figure out how do we have those conversations that none of us really want to have because we feel like we don't know enough, or we feel afraid, or we just don't want to have these kind of awkward, hard, difficult conversations. I've never known Pastor Libby to shy away from an awkward conversation since pretty much our whole relationship. We have had awkward conversations, and she has, that's all I'm gonna say, she has taught me how to be a little bit more courageous in the ways that I have conversations with people. And so I will turn it over to her. There will be time for questions and answers. Because we're live streaming and because we want to make sure everybody hears, I will be handing you a mic if you ask a question, even if you tell me that your voice is loud enough. It's not, so I'm gonna hand you a microphone. Okay.
Okay.
If you want to read more about like all her official stuff, you can go to Wisconsin Council of Churches website.
Okay. You don't need to do
I don't need to.
Okay. Thanks. Hello. Thanks for coming. Just a question before we get too far into our program for today is, do you have someone or something in mind who is difficult to talk to about things that matter a lot to you? If you do, raise your hand. Okay. Excellent. And when you think about that person, I'm going to need you to pass the microphone around already. I want to know what, just in a short sort of like, what is most difficult about that? So, who would be willing to share? Like, what's one of the things that's hard?
It's not a matter of what's hard. It's hard to engage and have a conversation when somebody puts their feelings above listening. So then they shut down you.
So say
as a
that.
speaker. Someone who puts their emotional defense and feelings, so it shuts them down, so it's hard for them to listen to what you have to say.
Okay.
So it's more the listener to how to engage into that listener.
So it's because, so when somebody else shuts down.
When somebody else shuts down when you're trying to have a conversation, so then it makes you shut down, and nothing ever gets you.
So
going.
how do we
you get
avoid
past?
shutting down?
Yes, the other, when
Okay.
you're trying to, but they put that protective barrier out there.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. So, other thoughts? Is that what everybody was going to say? Yeah, Beth.
My fear of judgment, of how they're going to judge my topic.
So, what, that you're going to say something and they're going to judge you? Yeah. Okay. What else? Michelle? Yeah, let's try to keep it as far away from one another as possible. So, go ahead.
Anger and yelling, like when you try to start that and then the other person escalates.
Okay, so if it gets heated, and either person, but definitely when somebody else gets
That just shuts me right
angry,
down. I
yeah.
just am like, okay, I'm done.
Okay. And what do you just keep the microphone, what do you typically do when somebody gets angry?
I just walk away.
You don't say anything, you
I
just,
just am like, okay.
okay,
I don't
Just
engage.
no more,
No more.
okay. Does anyone else have a different response when that happens? Does anybody fight back? Carla? Yeah, when someone gets angry, you get angry with them? Say that again.
My anger is readily available.
Yes.
So if you get angry with me, I'll get angry back. But I don't mean it like, I'll just meet it and then you just keep going. That's the difference is I don't want to stop it, I want to keep going. So I struggle more with when to stop.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah. Sue?
I fear saying the wrong thing. And so then that just keeps me from saying anything.
Okay. Saying the wrong thing and then not saying anything.
I find that the basis of the disagreement is the information upon which we are talking.
Mm-hmm.
And it's impossible for me to have enough information or enough information that they would believe is accurate to have a discussion that might impact on them.
Mm-hmm.
And I manage to control my emotion, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But the other people tend to not, and they just hop from one topic or point of discussion. If you discuss it and put up a little bit of resistance, they'll hop to something else that's not even remotely connected. And pretty soon, you're just chasing this nebulous.
Jason? Thank you for doing that.
I have the hardest time talking or having an argument with people whom I do not trust with the conversation. That's so like Carla and I, as she's my wife, we're good at arguing. We've practiced a long time. Like I feel safe when we are disagreeing.
Mm-hmm.
The people that I'm least apt to have an awkward conversation are people I don't trust will hear me or receive what I'm saying in the best light or be fair. And because I don't trust them, I just won't open my mouth to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Are those usually people you want to have more of a relationship with?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. Family, friends, strangers. For whatever reason, I don't trust that they're going to be fair or keep me safe in the process of arguing or awkward conversating.
Okay, thanks. So, since I've been alive, I feel like the polarization and the differences are more magnified now than what they were when I was younger. Does anybody else feel that way? Okay, that's because they are. Well, I think a lot of people might feel this way, but they don't. Why isn't my clicker working? Oh, because it wasn't on. So, if you can just see the graph, I don't care if you can read all the stuff, but just that graph, the lines at the bottom show race, religious attendance, education, age, and gender. So and what it's measuring is the partisan divide in those categories, in those demographics. The other one, over time, and this is from 1994 to 2017. So think about where you were in 1994 to about 5 years ago. That black line that has that steep incline is political party. So that's the rise in the level of the divide. So what we're experiencing, or what we think we see and what we think we feel, is actually happening. And there's reasons for that I'm not going to go into. This slide is from the Carter Center, and I just obtained these slides from them when I attended a program they did with Wisconsin Council of Churches called Why Are We So Divided? And so this is one of the slides they showed us. And then they talked about how we're divided among these different demographics, but that the partisan divide for both structural and sort of interrelated reasons, like what's going on in our brains even, are growing. And that some of that's intentional, some of that's what people want to have happen, people are manipulating us into that, and some of it is because of how we're structured as a democracy, and some of it is how we're wired in our brains. So that is happening, and I felt that was very validating. I'm like, is this just sort of how we feel because it's what we see? No, it's real. So another thing that's real, politics having become our identity. The American political parties are growing socially polarized. Religion and race, as well as class, geography, and culture, are dividing the parties in such a way that the effect of party identity is magnified. A single vote can now indicate a person's partisan preference, as well as his or her religion, race, ethnicity, gender, neighborhood, and favorite grocery store. This is no longer a single social identity. Partisanship can now be thought of as a mega identity, with all the psychological and behavioral magnifications that implies. And that is from Liliana Mason, Uncivil Agreement, How Politics Became Our Identity. More importantly, politics has become a religion. Meaning, and I like to think about religion in the sense of how we are connected to certain values and identities, because religion is from the same root word as the word ligament. And so think about how ligaments connect things. So this is one of the ways that people are being religious. The tendency to adopt a moralized identification with one political group and against another is saying that the foundational metaphor for tribalism is kinship. The foundational metaphor for political sectarianism, which is what we're experiencing, is religion, which evokes analogies focused less on genetic relatedness than on strong faith in the moral correctness and superiority one sect. So that's to say, the way he sort of made that a little more understandable was that we have a tendency now to not just say, I am, not just to identify with a particular party or a particular political leaning, but to believe that our way is righteous and the other way is evil. Like we're attaching these moral judgments to it that are significant. And so anytime then that we're trying to have a conversation with someone, if we're coming at it with that kind of zeal, like a zealot, that is going to already have a lot of anxiety, a lot of emotion, a lot of passion behind it. So that's why we experience both the intensity we do, and then depending on our own individual responses to the intensity, that fight or flight response. So we should know this: we are not rational. Our minds were designed for groupish righteousness. We are deeply intuitive creatures whose gut feelings drive our strategic reasoning. So Pastor Karen, why don't you say what you say into the microphone so everybody can hear you?
We are emotional beings who think, not thinking beings who emote.
So did you hear that? We are emotional beings who think. We are not thinking beings who emote. That emotional being is who we are before we think, not the other way around. And I think some of us would like to believe, no, we're thinking beings and we can control our emotions. The truth is the emotions often, in fact almost always, are leading the rationality, are leading the thinking, not the other way. And then there's this, back to why we're not rational, because we're still humans, we still have certain wiring, and belonging is more important than facts. So when you think about how people respond, especially in a time, like you were saying, with different information. If we're coming at a subject with two different sources of information and we don't trust the information that the other person has and they don't trust our information, coming at the other person with facts is not going to change the conversation very much. So, and that's because belonging is more important than facts. Having social support from an evolutionary standpoint is far more important than knowing the truth about some facts that do not directly impinge on your life. And I think that clause at the end is important. Sometimes when we're talking about things, one of the things that will affect the way the conversation goes is how much it directly impinges on your life. And there's a good quote that I'm going to share with you a little bit later about that. So here's that slide again, that graph, and you should know that it was not always like this. And so that's hopeful in that we have depolarized, we have been polarized as a country in the past for as long as we've been sort of measuring the indicators of that. And we have been much less polarized. We have never been more polarized. So we are sort of at a point right now when it's extreme. So here is, now I don't like that these lines are red and blue. All the red line indicates is the House, and the blue line indicates the Senate. And this is a timeline from 1879 to 2007. So it's covering a lot of ground. But if you look at that, what you have is on the, do I have a pointer? I wonder if I have a pointer. Do I? Ooh, I do. Okay, so the vertical here measures the level of polarization between the parties, not between the House and the Senate, but between the parties in the House and in the Senate. So look where we were at the beginning, basically at the end of the Civil War during Reconstruction, and then look how far down we went. That was right between that was right after and when the Second World War was happening. was when we were least polarized. And that's when you would have both parties being supportive of social welfare programs, of job creation programs, of anything that was going to help people prosper. Both parties were agreeing on that most of the time. And then since then, which is in most of our lifetimes, as I'm looking out at the ages in the room, it has just gotten increasingly more and more and more polarized. But you can see that we've been almost as high as we are now, and we have been much lower. So I think that's pretty hopeful, because those things that can make it structurally and culturally possible to be less polarized, we can influence, and that's not what we're going to talk about today, but that is possible. That's another Faith Alive view, okay? I'm just keeping myself in business here, yeah. What we're going to talk about today is more of that, because this thing happens on, this depolarization happens on several levels. We experience it most directly in interpersonal relationships, but it has to be addressed in our communal relationships and then even in our global relationships. And those take different kinds of measures than what we're going to be talking about today, which is when we're in a conversation with one other person, what do we actually have control of? What can we do in that situation? So the reason I asked Jason the question I did a few minutes ago was, are these people that you actually want to have a relationship with? Because if you're trying to influence and impact people, or you're trying to have conversations with people that you're not interested in a relationship with, that's really not what I'm talking about here today. I'm talking about people that you're hoping to establish interpersonal connection with, or to deepen it if you already have it. There are, and most of this, when I think about how I might come to this workshop, I might think, I'm going to go hear Pastor Libby or somebody tell me what I can do to change another person's mind. How can I be more effective in my persuasion or manipulation, or my convincing them that I'm right and they should see the light? That's probably not what's going to happen here today. So if that's what you were hoping for, my apologies. Instead, I'm going to talk to you about you and how you bring yourself to any conversation that you're having. So thinking about the overall of interpersonal connection, and that sort of being a bridge between, I like alliteration. I have 3 I's, and then I'll have 3 C's. So the first 3 I's are these: your identity, your integrity, and your intention. So who are you, and what are your values? Your identity. Because if you go into a conversation arguing, this is the example I have, if I'm arguing about, or if I'm really trying to help somebody see my point of view, and I'm talking about how we should care for the poor, and how important it is not to criminalize poverty, because there's so many circumstances that influence whether or not someone's poor. And I keep talking about how we need to love our neighbor, but I'm doing it in such a way that is dehumanizing to the person I'm talking about. Then there's no real integrity in that, first of all. Here I am talking about loving my neighbor over there, that hypothetical person, and the one I'm talking to, I'm treating like crap, so that doesn't work. Or I'm working out of my identity, which is, if this is my value to love our neighbor, then how is this conversation expressing that love, right? We can't talk about loving our neighbor and be unloving while we're doing it. And I think intuitively we know that, but that is a challenge for us, especially if the person we're talking to has no problem doing that back to us. But we can only control ourselves, so that we'll kind of keep going back to that. You can only control yourself. You cannot control someone else. And then, what's your intention going into any conversation? So, we're going to talk a little bit about this. When you think about the person that some of you who shared earlier, if you were to set up, if you were like just to be very intentional about setting up a conversation with them, how would you, in one sentence, say, here's why I want to have this conversation. Here's why this matters to me. What might you say? Yeah, Karen's going to come to you and be brave. There are people who are looking down at their shoes. She's not going to make you talk unless you raise your hand. Like, go ahead, Sharon, thank you.
Here's why I want to have this conversation with you. We're family.
We're family.
We're family. And the people you're hurting are also family.
Mm-hmm.
And so you need to know that their gender identity.
You need to know what?
You need to know that their gender identity is important to them, or you need to know that your judgment on this issue is really causing pain, and that's why they're not on the phone with us. And I'm talking really close here.
Yeah.
But I'm that aunt that a lot of nieces and nephews talk to when they can't talk to their parent or can't talk, you know. And so I'm just saying, I feel that a lot. And so that would be how I would come to your question originally was, why do you want to do this?
Right.
And it's because we're family. It's really painful if we don't find some way of reconciling.
So the shared value that you would be able to draw on in that moment with that person is the importance of having healthy, loving family connections, right?
Yeah.
So,
or stopping the unhealthy movement.
right, but you're always better off coming to
At the
someone saying the positive thing you have in common,
Yeah.
rather than the thing they need to do to stop whatever's wrong, right?
You're exactly right.
So saying something like, I want to have this conversation with you because I know there are people in our family who are hurting, and I know that you...
Help me help you.
That's usually not going to work very well. Right, but I know there's people in our family that are hurting, and I don't think either one of us want that. Right? So you're saying, you're putting you both in the same box. So instead of making the person the problem, you're finding a way to align yourself with them, something basic that there is in common, and put yourself over against the problem, which is out there, not the person. So we're going to separate the person from the problem or the ideas, or we're at least going to try. So let's keep going. What are you doing? I'm going to sit down. Oh, that's fine, yeah. Okay. So when you think about the intention, and we're going to do a little bit more with that in a little bit more this in a little while, but moving to the 3 C's. So this is interpersonal connection, 3 I's, 3 C's: curiosity, compassion, and courage. So these things come, I mean, oftentimes what's propelling or what's motivating us into one of these hard conversations, especially with family or friends that we love, is that they have done something that we know is hurtful, or they've said things that are not okay with us. Before we tell them that, which they may already know, but before we would tell them that, we need to check our own curiosity, compassion, and courage. So, if we're leading with curiosity, and maybe this is a practice of cultivation, because you may not actually feel curious about why somebody says or does hateful, terrible things in your estimation, but asking them, and you don't say, gee, why do you say hateful, terrible things? Trying to figure out what's going on, where they're coming from, what's happening before they ever get to actually saying something. What story, what emotions, what experiences inform and influence how they're coming to that belief. I heard a story of a man who, and this is in a book, a really good book called The Persuaders by Anand Giridharadas, and if you want more about that book, I can give you it at the end. But he He followed organizers and activists around for about 3 years. And one group he followed around in Arizona when they were doing what's called deep canvassing. And if any of you have ever canvassed for a political candidate, canvassing is trying to get to as many houses as you can with your info and information in as little time as possible. So you're just trying to get, the numbers matter. Deep canvassing is, you wouldn't, in the initial one, you wouldn't want to spend more than like 5 minutes at someone's house if you actually got to talk to a person. Deep canvassing is you don't want to spend less than 30 minutes at someone's house. So deep canvassing is not for everybody, right? But there's a story of deep canvassing. They were working on the DACA Act. They were trying to get to as many as 17,000 houses with their deep canvassing effort. And this person that he was following around had a survey, and they would just say, do you have a few minutes to talk to me? And if they said yes, great. And they had just 10 questions that they asked, and the 10 questions were the same for everybody. And they asked them very neutrally, just what do you think about this? Have you heard of that? And they would just receive the answers as information, as data. And then in the course of that, what happened with one person, and of course this is anecdotal, but these are the kinds of stories I like because it says it's possible. So in the course of that, they said, what are your feelings about the Dreamers Act, the DACA? I hate it. The person said, I hate it. I don't know any immigrants. I don't want to know any immigrants. I feel like they should all just go back where they belong. All of those sorts of things that was very anti. And the person receiving said, okay, got it, thank you. And then they asked a question that said, have you ever, a question similar but not quite the same, that was, what has been your experience with people who are from different countries? So didn't put the label immigrant on it, didn't use any of the politically charged, but just from people from different countries. Well, my brother-in-law is from a different country. And just as they said that, they were like, oh, my brother-in-law's an immigrant. My brother-in-law's an immigrant. And so one of the things that going deeper into a conversation or leading with some of this curiosity can do is sort of like help people connect dots they wouldn't typically connect. So if we're just talking about immigrants out there and not my brother-in-law who I've known for 20 years and who probably has faced these things but never felt safe enough to perhaps talk about them as that. So anyway, in the course of the conversation, he just found that person started hearing themselves and thinking about things differently and putting things together. He doesn't think he changed anybody's mind, but the curiosity that could led that person to some thoughts and to saying some things that they probably wouldn't have said otherwise. And all they did was ask some questions. All they did was genuinely want to know what their experience was. So that curiosity is really critical. And then I think as Christians, both compassion and courage. Compassion is that we would cultivate empathy for people even when we don't particularly care for what they're saying or doing. And courage when we are in a conversation with someone, and this is what I found because I identify a little more with Carla and her very ready rage. Now you're going to have a reputation. But I find there's more people that I'm talking with, maybe it's the region of the country that we're in, who don't have their rage at the ready. Instead, they will shut down. So they need a little bit of encouragement to say more in the situation where they feel like there might be, because they're ready, they're fine shutting down. That's more, and what they need is a little bit of help, maybe saying the wrong thing occasionally just because they have to keep the conversation going. So I think that, who would think they're more like that? Who's gonna shut down and walk away? Yeah. And who's gonna keep it going? Yeah, so that's typical of most of the rooms that I've done this in, so I may not be the best. Sometimes I'm like, maybe it should be someone else doing this. I love these microphones so much. They're my favorite in the whole world. I'm not fiddling with it. Okay. So, compassion and then that courage. What is it that's gonna? The courage is gonna come from the place of this matters enough to me that, or this relationship matters. So it's either the issue itself or the relationship is gonna keep me here a little bit farther than I might typically wanna go. I'm not gonna give up as quickly as I would. And I think this takes practice. I think you maybe stay for one more question and then you can shut down. And then you get better at it the next time. But you just decide, you just tell yourself you're not gonna check out so early. And you push yourself to stick with it and ask one more curious question. So there's a few verses, Bible verses, that kind of anchor this work for me. The first is Micah 6:8, and I've read this verse my whole life. It's one of the ones that's most quoted of our prophets because it just sounds so beautiful. He has told you, O mortal, what is good, what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God. I'm not sure why, but when I've heard that for most of my life, I thought I got to pick one of those three things. I'm going to be one of the justice doers. Other people can do one of the kindness lovers and the humble walkers. But I think it was sometime recently, I hate to say it was that recently, that I was like, oh, I think Micah means we should do all these things at the same time. And that's really tough. It's really tough to do that. But I do think that's what we're being called on to do. Matthew 22, what does the Lord require of you? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. On this hang everything else. So these are just, like when it comes to who you are, again, that identity, the integrity, and the intention you have with a conversation, it's to express love, it's to be somebody who cares about justice, both for the person you don't know and can't see and the person you do know and can see. And then 1 Corinthians 13, if I speak in the tongues of mortals and of angels but don't have love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. So those were the three verses, and I forgot to advance the slide. So this is one of the quotes that I'm going to read you about what's happening in a conversation when one person has more of an emotional connection than the other. It says, when you debate a person about something that affects them more than it affects you, remember that it will take a much greater emotional toll on them than on you. For you, it may feel like an academic exercise. For them, it feels like revealing their pain, only to have you dismiss their experience and sometimes their humanity. The fact that you might remain more calm under these circumstances is a consequence of your privilege, not what we would like to claim, which is some sort of superior capacity to be objective on your part and to stay humble in that. And so just to be aware when that's happening, and it's happening right now in our church, the conversation around welcome, the fact that there's people in every room that any of us are ever in who are LGBTQIA+, who are feeling marginalized in some way or another, and that there are people who would then say, I'm going to vote on whether or not that's okay with me. There's something a little dehumanizing in that process. It still needs to happen because we have to be better than we've been in the past, and this is a step in that direction. It's also a step in recognizing that the church itself has been perpetuators of some of these things against different groups of people, especially LGBTQ people. So I think some of that's on folks to just recognize, look, if that's a conversation happening, I don't need to be in that room. I identify with that community, so I don't have to be in every room where that conversation is happening. I'm not going to tell the conversation not to happen because I think it needs to, but I don't have to always be there because it's not good for my soul to hear people do that. But I think it's also important for people who are talking about it that aren't as invested, that aren't aren't as emotionally close to it, to recognize that as a matter of their privilege and to have even more compassion for engaging somebody for whom it's a much closer emotional experience. So that awareness is so significant in these conversations. We're not going to, the next things on that sheet of paper that I've just gone through are 3 situations that if we have time, I might ask you just to talk with someone next to you and think about how you might respond in those situations. All of those are real. One of them is actually me in the situation. You have to just guess which one. But I asked some other people to give me some scenarios that they could. But maybe you have your own and we'll do a little workshopping of those too. I'd like to talk now about principles of nonviolent communication. So and I imagine you already intuitively or you have just learned and practiced some of these things and you know this is the case. Sometimes these awkward conversations happen because there hasn't been a lot of thought put into it, right? Like the first time I led this, I was called awkward holiday conversation. So what's going to come up at a Thanksgiving table or a Christmas Eve gathering with family, especially if you haven't seen people for a long time? What's going to come up, and then what are you going to say in the moment? Because that feels like it kind of catches us off guard. We haven't had the opportunity to say to someone, gee, I'd really like to talk with you about this because I know we both care about our family. So that's not always possible. It is still possible for you to have, just because it happens spontaneously, doesn't mean you can't have a plan for what you would do when it happens. You just don't know when you're going to need that plan. But to have thought through, what will I do if so-and-so? And usually you have the person's name in mind. If so-and-so says this, or if somebody mentions that. So what are your own assumptions to make sure when you're having conversation with others that you know what they are and how they're shaping your thoughts, feelings, and actions? The only helpful thing you can assume is that you don't know all there is to know. So one of the most important things is to imagine that even the person that's saying things or doing things that are very upsetting to you, that there are things about them that you don't know and don't understand, that there's something for you to learn. That is part of empathy and listening. And one of the challenges with being empathetic is that people are afraid, and I confess to this myself, that if I'm too empathetic with someone, I might give them the impression that I agree with them. And I don't, there are some things when we're talking about it, under no circumstances would I want them to think that I am in agreement with them. What I can continue to do is say, I see where you're coming from, or I hear what you're saying. That's not saying I agree with you. In fact, you can also say, I see it differently. And that's I find that phrase, I see it differently, those 4 words work really well because they can lead to an invitation or the possibility that someone will say, well, how do you see it? Or you could say, I see it differently, and if they don't say that, you might say, would you be willing to hear how I see it as well? And so just instead of just launching into, here's how I see it, here's why you're wrong, to give them a moment to realize there might be another way to see this, and then even to decide, are they willing to listen to it? But that space is helpful. And I think for myself, that space is not always easy to give. Here's one that's also difficult for me, because I really like winning. Trying to win is the opposite of empathy. So if the goal of the conversation is for the other person to say, you're right and I'm wrong, you win, I lose, and that's okay with me, that's not going to work out very well. And I do think that sometimes That's my hope. I really do want that to happen. I really want whatever I share, whatever I feel, whatever I believe, I want somebody to see how so watertight that argument is and so righteous that it is, that they will say that to me. Yes, Libby, you are right. I love it when people say that. I even recorded somebody when they said that to me one time. And I just don't think that's usually what's going to happen. And it's also not going to happen just in one conversation. Again, this is somebody that you would have or would have a desire to have a long relationship with. So there's a little move you can make in one conversation. You can get somewhere, and that can be enough. And then it just keeps the door open for the next time. It doesn't all have to happen at the same time. And the goal would be to get to the end of whatever interaction you're having with both of you feeling like you might want to keep talking about it instead of thinking, we'll never bring this up again. Empathy is a skill that can be strengthened through practice. It's intentional, curious, and compassionate. I know why I'm messing with it, because it's my hair. Okay. 4 attributes of empathy: to be able to see the world as others see it, to be non-judgmental, to understand their feelings, to communicate the understanding. So that skill of being able to say, what I hear you saying is, do I have it right? And really ask someone, am I hearing you correctly? Is that what you mean to say? Before you launch into making sure they hear you. One of the things about empathetic listening is that a lot of us, and we do this all the time, you cannot not ever do this, but you can do it less, which is wait to talk instead of listen. Who waits to talk? Who's like, I hope they stop talking so I can finally say what's actually important here. Okay, I'll just keep nodding and I'll look like I care. Finally, they shut up so I can say what matters. That's waiting to talk. That's not actually listening. So, we're striving for listening. This is the emotional congruence. We can go through this pretty fast, because again, when people feel listened to, they're much more likely to hear us back. What we're trying to engender is a space, and I was thinking about this when Jason was talking about safety. How do we, if we are feeling unsafe, how can we be a person who creates a safe space? And I think one of those is to be curious and to be interested in what they're saying. And then, as you do it, to invite them to do the same. So say you're talking with someone who just keeps talking. You mentioned somebody who's going to just jump around from subject to subject, especially if they feel like they might be getting cornered or like whatever's happening. So it's okay in a conversation to kind of you don't have to call a timeout, but to kind of for yourself, take a breath and be like, I see you're jumping around from subject to subject. Can we go back to that other one for a minute? Would you be willing to keep talking about that? I mean, just what I feel like that kind of does if someone's being recalcitrant with you, is it puts them on notice that you can see what they're doing, and they're inviting them to be better. You're inviting them to do it differently. So instead of doing that, could we go back to this? And if and they may say no, right? They may say, no, I don't want to talk about that anymore. You're like, okay, we don't have to talk about that. What would you like to talk about? Or you can say, I don't think we can talk about, I think we'll have to be done now. I mean, that's the other, you can always call time out, you can always say we can be done now, because if it's going to get to the point where you know the door would close and not be able to open again, then you'd kind of want to stop the conversation before you get there. Say, I feel like we've said what we need to say here today, and I want to make sure we can still keep talking about this in the future. So let's is it okay with you if we just stop talking for now about these things, and then maybe take it to something lighter? You don't have to just talk about that thing either. You could start talking about the Packers or the weather. So this is a good, Terry Pratchett is a British humorist. He died in 2015. He's a prolific author. A good plan isn't one where somebody wins, it's one where nobody thinks they've lost. So to get to the end of a conversation where nobody thinks they've lost is a win. Knowing your triggers. I have a friend who tells me to breathe a lot. So do you, actually. She's your pastor, Karen. She just knowing what's happening in your own body, paying attention. Mostly these tough conversations are happening faster than they need to happen. So one of the things you can always do is just slow yourself down to slow the conversation down. Just let everybody breathe. Just take a pause, notice your body, take your time, and talk when you're ready. And if you're not, you have control over saying, I'm not sure I'm ready to talk about this. I don't know if I can talk about this anymore. I'd like to keep doing it another time perhaps, but right now I'm not able to. So you're not saying, you've pissed me off so much that I can't talk to you ever again, which is how it could be heard, unless you say, I know I want to talk about it, I just can't right now. You kind of leave that door open. Allowing for conflicted feelings. People are complicated, they change their minds, they cannot change other people, but you can always present new information, new experiences, perspective that can impact and influence. So it's one thing to say you can't change other people and then throw your hands up and say, well, if I'm not going to change them, why would I even try? Well, because people do change. You have changed. I mean, if you think about your own life, what is different? What have you thought at one point in your life, and what did it take for you to have a completely different view of that? Was it knowing somebody? Was it learning things? How long did it take to happen? Probably more than just one conversation. So to allow for that possibility in other people, one of the worst things I think that's happening right now culturally for us is we're being fed the lie that wherever we are right now, wherever we've sort of stuck ourselves, is the only place we could ever be. That people can't change. That wherever they are, or wherever I am, this is it forevermore. And that it's even weak to not be that way, right? So I saw this most when George W. Bush was in office. He had the phrase, I'm the decider. And the way he would sort of emphasize not changing his mind, not incorporating new information, not learning something that could possibly change a trajectory was considered a strong way to lead. We don't have to buy that lie. That isn't a strong way to lead or just to be. We can incorporate new information, and when we do that, we can change. And we can say, I once thought this, and then I learned this, and now I think this. That doesn't mean we're waffly, it doesn't mean we're weak, it doesn't mean that we're being blown about by, what's the biblical language, by all the false teachers, right? Because you know the biblical language. Yeah. For freaking out. I'm going to say my heart is troubled much more than freaking out now. And the people change at their own pace. So I mentioned this before, searching for commonality, being honest, speaking only for yourself. I think that's something we can also learn from Jesus when he's having conversations with people, especially the conversation where he says, who do you say that, or who do people say that I am? And they're ready. They're so ready with all the answers to that. People say you're Elijah. They've heard everybody. They've heard all the people and what the people are saying. And then he kind of hones in on, but who do you say I am? And so oftentimes these conversations, especially if they're being spoken of, if you're talking about an issue in hypothetical terms and it doesn't address the experience of one of the people in the conversation directly, you could talk about it in a way that's so distant that you're not really challenging yourself or the other person to say what you think, right? I know you're saying what so-and-so thinks. Is that what you think? Tell me what you believe. And when you do that, I think it can express, I care what you think. And it can also express, I don't really need you to tell me what everybody else thinks. I care about you in this relationship, the one we're in right now. And then I said, stick it out. Resist generalizing groups in disparaging ways, which is one of the case studies. I'll just admit that's mine. Number 2 was me. It's a holiday gathering of staff members, small, close-knit church staff, their families. They broadly know each other's political leanings. Mostly they're more left than right, but there are at least 2 who are more right than left. The boss, hoping to make substantive but easy conversation, asks if others saw the tweet from a local Republican politician that day that reflects the best of the holiday season, urging people to generosity and kindness. The lefter employee says, "Wow, that doesn't sound like a Republican. That guy sounds like he has a heart." The writer employee says, "I'm a Republican, and I have a heart." And the lefter employee, feeling embarrassed, says, "Of course you have a heart. We all know you do, but come on, you can't deny." Tries to take it back into that generalization. Just listen how they talk. It's all fear-mongering. I mean, you can hear that, right? So now, in that embarrassment and that defensiveness, moving it back to the generalization, but then accusing the person of not being able to see, which only makes people feel more defensive and stupid. So making people feel stupid is not the best way to a good conversation. She starts to cry and says, "I'm not talking about the Republican Party, I'm talking about you, saying I don't have a heart when you know that's not true about me. It hurts when you say things like that. I'm a Republican, I try really hard to be loving to everyone." She gets up and leaves the table. Her husband follows her to the living room, trying to comfort her. So the question on that is, what's next? What do you do? What do you think you should do? Mama knows. Sue.
Sounds like an apology is in order. Sounds like there's an apology in the order.
Probably. Yeah. When and how might need some thought. Maybe. I can say that an apology was tried, but it was not well received. What else? What should the repair look like? What's happened? Mary. Go ahead.
Someone responded to a specific situation, the statement from the politician, the holiday statement, with a generalization that they may or may not have had backed up with a lot of facts.
Sure.
Yeah.
Right. So that would have been a way to avoid, instead of just thinking about what happened next, what could have gone differently, like even in this scenario. So the boss says, listen to this tweet. I mean, it was such a positive comment, right? And then what came out was something really negative. And so our tendency when we're feeling or when we know these are things that matter so much to us, if we have a tendency to make those generalizations or to think that we're in a room, I mean, this is another thing, to think we're in a room where everybody would agree with us, right? Sometimes we think we're in that room and we're not. Because people can hear what the I would say that in this situation, she would never have said the same thing. The Republican would never have said the same thing in that room. If it had been reversed, because she knows she's in the minority in that room. So she's not going to say something general about lefts because she knows she's not she doesn't have the will of the people behind her in that moment. The other employee did, but did not anticipate that woman would say what she did and call her on it, call her out, call her on it. So here's another thing. There's a video by a woman named Loretta Ross. Go to YouTube and look for Loretta Ross. She is an organizer, activist. She works, I think she's at Smith College, and she talks about calling people in instead of calling people out. So the call-out culture that we often hear spoken about, or that in the circles I run in, typically, this has become a way of virtue signaling. If I can call somebody out on their racism or on their ableism or on their homophobia, then I have shown you that I know these things and I would never do that. But in the meantime, I've also potentially unnecessarily embarrassed and humiliated somebody. So it's not that that should never happen, but I think that there are, especially with, I'll say this, I think there's different rules for people who live very public lives versus more intimate family conversations. So if you want me to say more about that, I can do that later. But when I'm talking about those intimate friend groups or family groups, those people that you intend to have relationships with, embarrassing and humiliating one another or calling people out in such a way that would really damage them instead of, which is different, I think, than showing a politician that the words that they're saying and the votes that they're making are two different things. That's public behavior and deserves public criticism, public critique. That's not, do you see the difference? Okay, I just want to make sure that you understand what I'm saying. But Loretta Ross, she tells a story about being at a family gathering, hearing a family member say something very negative, and basically saying to him, she doesn't argue with him about what he said. She says, you know, Uncle so-and-so, I've known you my whole life, and I just know you to be an incredibly loving and kind person, and so it just really surprises me when I hear you say something like that. That just doesn't sound like who I know you to be. And so what she's doing is two things. She's not embarrassing him, or she's at least trying not to. I think if you hear that, you hear somebody saying, I know that you are kinder and more loving than this. She's calling them back to the better version of themselves. She's calling them back into that, maybe up to that. But she's also showing everybody else in the room that she's not going to let something like that go without saying something about it. You don't just get to say whatever that was and not be challenged about it at all. So there's some space, what I hope we can learn how to do is find the in-between space between saying nothing and just outright like slamming somebody. That there's a way to be in relationship with people that can have positive impact and influence and that doesn't shut the relationship down, especially if it's one where you have the intention of wanting to keep it going. So you have a conversation guide. What time is it? Could keep going. Okay, we're going to stop here. We should do some questions. But I wanted to show you this conversation guide, and that's on the back of, I think, the page that talks about nonviolent communication. This is the ideal, okay? So this obviously isn't necessarily the spontaneous, but even if something happens that you're not expecting, again, if you have sort of a plan or you're prepared for it, you could know that you would say to that person aside, privately, I'd love to, would you have some time to talk to me a little later? Or could I give you a call? I mean, where you're not going to do it in front of everybody, you're not necessarily going to do it right then, but this matters to me. And when you say this matters to me, you're saying you matter to me if you're inviting someone into a conversation. So, being aware of power or authority differences due to age or relationship. If you are in a position of authority, it's up to you to give that over as much as possible to have a more mutual and reciprocal conversation. So I'm thinking about parents and kids. There are times when you automatically come with something heavier that puts them on the defensive before you've even started talking. I even experienced this with my younger sister, because I'm the older sister and she's the younger sister. And so even if I'm genuinely asking a question, there are times when she hears me judging her. She hears me criticizing her. And so I have to be super explicit to say, I am not judging you. I seriously just want to understand what's going on, what you're doing, because I don't, and I need your help. Making a goal that the conversation goes well. Check in with yourself. How are you feeling? Is it a good time? Most of these conversations are not emergencies, so don't treat them like they are. Set your intention to genuinely listen. Think about what you want to say and what you don't want to say. Here's what I'm not going to say is almost as important as what you are going to say. Think about what you want to learn. So that's, when you're sitting there listening, not just what you're going to say, but what you're going to learn, and think about how you want to start. And then during the conversation, to start slowly, to be real, to say why it matters, ask those open-ended questions. The hope is that you modeling this in some way, especially if it's someone who you find to be a challenge to talk to, which is typical, that they would respond in kind. And if they don't, that you could pause the conversation sometime and invite them to respond in kind of like what I was saying to you. Listening with empathy and pay attention to the underlying values. So, someone saying things about, let's stick with immigration for a minute. Someone saying things about immigrants. They're stealing our jobs. They're bringing crime. So even though nothing that they're saying can be backed up with facts, as far as I'm concerned, what I could hear them saying is, so it sounds like you're really concerned that people who need jobs have jobs. I mean, it could be that basic. Or it sounds like you're concerned for, you really care about the safety of our communities. And because then you can both care about the safety of your communities. You can both care about people having meaningful work. And they can hear you hearing them say that, and then move on to being able to talk about whether or not it's really immigrants who are keeping people from having meaningful work, or if it's a greedy capitalist society. I don't know. You decide which one it is. Use connecting language like, how do you see it? I hear what you're saying. I know this can be difficult sometimes. Resist that debating on facts or statistics. And I mean, seriously, debate. It doesn't mean you can't present different facts or statistics. That just you wouldn't get into because there's just nothing good that's going to come of going back and forth with different facts and different statistics, because you are as immovable as they are. And so just getting mad at them because they won't change their mind, well, neither are you. I'm not changing my mind about it either. So that's not going to be productive. Again, to be able to say something like, I didn't realize that, I haven't heard what you're saying. I've heard something else. I mean, just sort of like, at least open the instead of saying you're right and I'm wrong, or you're wrong and I'm right, you're saying there's clearly two different narratives playing out, at least, when it comes to this issue. And making space in the conversation to hear both of those stories instead of saying one is right and the other is wrong. And you have to listen to theirs as much as they have to listen to yours. That pausing and checking in with yourself, if you're starting to get revved up, to take some slow, deep breaths, to shift the conversation if you're finding yourself overwhelmed. You seem to be really passionate about this. I think I need some time, so can we pick it up later? You can always say that. And then to be thankful and maybe even say something about what you learned. Thanks for talking to me about this. And those are, at first, I think these are things that might feel awkward because this isn't how we typically communicate. We just sort of let conversations end where they end instead of kind of closing it and saying thank you and here's what I learned and I hope we can talk again. But I think that's such an important thing to be able to do in order to set up the next interaction whenever or wherever that could be. So I'm going to open up for questions. So what are some of the things as we've been talking or I've been talking that you've been thinking about? Yeah, John. Microphone coming.
I saw something online that very similar lines where there's a personal interaction and somebody insults the other person, and the best 3-word comeback, so to speak, that they said was, are you okay?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
And I don't know, I just wanted to put that out there and what your thoughts were
No,
on
that's,
that.
no, I think that's we've heard Pastor Karen talk in her sermons about bids for connection. I think doing that is exactly that. It's where you take it away from sort of this issue you might be talking about and you move it back into the bid for connection into that person. So I think that's an excellent thing to do. What else are you thinking about, or play stump the pastor? So, yeah, Carla.
One of the things I've been thinking about is, they say kids and bees can smell fear. All of these awkward conversations, when they are not rooted in authenticity, right? Like, if you're trying to have a difficult conversation with someone and the other person is just telling you what they think you want to hear, or, just to please you or to make it go away or any of that, or in reverse, if you're not bringing your authentic self to the conversation, it's a giant waste of time and people get hurt.
Mm-hmm.
So I think whenever I enter into any of these, like, authenticity is the first thing that I consider is, am I ready to be authentic? And do I trust that the other person is also being genuine and authentic, or are they just giving lip service to?
Mm-hmm.
Because the other piece that keeps coming up as I'm listening to you is I think it's socially taught somehow, not to Libby or me, but to most people, that it's not okay to ask for what we need, that's selfish or unfaithful or whatever. And so I find myself in lots of conversations or relationships, and then you find out, well, all along that person wasn't asking for what they needed. And then that comes back, and so it's okay to ask for what you need. Or to begin with, I need to be vulnerable right now, and I'm going to share some things that are going to be difficult, and I need you to just listen and not respond, or I need you to not answer right now, or just, it's okay to say what you need, and that's so countercultural.
Right, because folks, it's not even that we're taught not to say it, we're actually taught not to need it.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah.
You're not allowed to have needs, period.
Right.
And you
Because
certainly
that's
aren't allowed
selfish.
to ask someone else to help you meet them.
Right.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So to be authentic and to ask for what you need, I think, are key pieces to a successful, awkward conversation.
Yeah, that's in that sort of agenda setting of the conversation too. Here's why this matters. Here's what I need. Here's what I hope. In the beginning.
And then I guess my question is, because I know you and I are similar here,
I'm very comfortable in that awkward space. I can sit there all day.
Yep.
Most people can't.
Right.
And so then I find that most people, then they just don't want to talk to me. They're like, right? So, like, and I end up feeling like I'm the one that's wrong, right? And or whatever. So I think identifying where you fall on that spectrum, and like for me, it's really important for me to keep, this is easy for me, but it's hard for them. And so I need to be more patient, or I need to be more respectful of how hard this is for them, because I'm like, what's the big deal?
Or how long it's going to take. So my
Right.
problem is patience in that one. I mean, patience is always my problem. But it kind of undoes me to have something hanging in between in a relationship that's unresolved, that's not. And so my tendency will be to push that conversation. I want to have that conversation now so that we can work this out and move on. Well, that's not, I mean, I have friends that they want to do that, but they can't do it at my pace. And so what I need from them in that moment is to say, well, we'll do that, but not right now. Like, give me a day or two. Like, I actually need a little bit of timeline, like, well, when? Because otherwise I'm just left like, this will be unresolved forever. And I don't want it to be unresolved forever. I think we grow when we can move through those conversations and relationships with people. So, yeah. Go ahead, Jason.
I wanted to offer something where people could see me, so I'm not
You're
trying
gonna
do
what?
anything, but I just wanted to say a comment about this. But
Okay.
I'm sitting in the back, so. I'm thinking specifically about our upcoming welcome statement and endorsing it. And I just wrote this lovely letter to everyone, and it echoed my newsletter. But like, one of my concerns about being patient about these conversations is I don't want to have this conversation with anybody about the welcome statement on the 21st. Like, that's not the time and place to have these conversations. And so that's my anxiety, is about like, we need to have these, like, to have a genuine, authentic conversation. I'm writing these words down. I think faithfulness in this case is going to be fueled by caring conversations that are done well. And I know there will be a healthy amount of apathy and maybe people who just are outright against what the welcome statement is about. I'd like to have anybody talk to me about that, or talk to Pastor Karen, or talk to any of us on the Reconciling in Christ team. And I'm not having any of those conversations, and I'm feeling anxious about that. So I'm not one to seek out conflict. I'm not one to, I don't like that. That's not my happy place is not in the awkwardness. But it's going to be, it's like, so there's interpersonal conversations, and then there's also the consideration of awkward conversation among, in our case, a family of faith. And so how do those get done most faithfully? And I guess part of it is what I'm suggesting, that it happens at all.
Yeah.
Is faithful.
So does anyone else want to respond to that before I do? I'm curious what others would have to say about that first.
So I'll give you an example.
Okay.
And chime in if you have, there's a group at church who has told me a couple times in the last few weeks, Pastor, there's people who have questions, and they don't feel comfortable with where we're going or how we're going there. Who are they? What are the thoughts? Well, I can't say anything. Right. So what are we going to do about that? Right? I mean, where does that leave any of us? Where does that leave our church? So that's,
yeah.
I have feelings about that.
Well, and of course there's like what we know about healthy systems is that's not, I mean, that kind of, and so to give a lot of time and attention to the anonymous, the person who, I don't think that's something we want to give a lot of time and energy to. I mean, and we just sort of do live with the anxiety until until that day or whatever, and recognize that that's a part of doing justice and loving kindness and walking humbly all at the same time. Because I do think this is about doing justice. And justice cannot wait for everybody to be ready for it all the time. It doesn't work like that. And we have to be caring for those who have been harmed more than those who have done the harm. I mean, and those are sort of the values we sort of stick ourselves in when we're in a situation like this. Recognize that may mean people make choices. We didn't make anybody do anything. People make choices about where they can stay or where they have to go or who they're going to talk to or when they're going to talk about it. To continue to give the invitation to have the conversation, I think it's most likely that folks are not talking about it because they already know it's happening. It's going to happen. This is not, I mean, we've been worshiping with this theme. It really isn't something that we're voting on, so to speak. It's something that we're endorsing. We've already told everybody this is where we're headed. And I'm very thankful for that. I think that's the right thing to do. But I know that everybody doesn't think that. So that means they will need to decide where they're going to place themselves in the future. And as a community, we have to, I think, recognize the space that there are people in every faith community, every group of people who are at odds with the groupthink as a whole. There are individuals who aren't all in. So we have norms for how we behave in order to make sure that that person isn't ostracized, but they also don't get to have a lot of power necessarily when the rest of the group has decided to move forward. There are times when that person eventually becomes the prophet. I don't think that's what's going to happen in this case. I think those who are wanting to stay with the status quo are those who have enjoyed a level of privilege and comfort that it's now time to relinquish so that some other people can have that too. Sharon? We can't hear you. I don't think it's on. Gosh, who would have done that?
He really didn't want to hear. He just put the invitation out. No, when you step on my toe and I say, you're stepping on my toe and that hurts, and then you continue doing it, that's bullying. When you step on my toe and I tell you it hurts and you try to walk away or stop and stop others from doing that, that's important. And I think in the case of bullying, when they say it's not my intent, I didn't mean it, whatever, it doesn't matter. It's how I interpret the perspective. I'm telling you, it hurts. That's the perspective that's important. And I think in this movement, this change, this new new way of thinking is that when we want to live as a Christian, we want to embrace everyone. And if they're hurting and you're the one causing that pain, then something has to change, something has to give.
And I think
that's an Emic perspective.
And that's more, and I think theologically for Christians, that's more than just we want to include everybody.
Yes.
That's what we call the theology of the cross. Yes. That's what we call listening to where the suffering is and listening to where the pain is and going there, like Jesus does. We're not going to stand far away from it, and we're not going to tell you it doesn't hurt, and we're not going to, because that's more comfortable for us. That's not the way of Jesus. And so if we have friends and neighbors that are saying, I'm hurt, this hurts, and we're doing something to contribute to it. That's why it bugs me so much when people are like, this is just you being political. It isn't. It's Jesus. I'm following Jesus. So don't tell me I'm just being political.
Right.
Yeah.
And we protect the widows and the orphans, and we protect the old, and we protect the needy, and that is walking with our Lord.
Yeah. I think that we should wrap it up. Pastor Karen, would you like to pray for us before we go?
Sure.
Thanks. I knew you
I'm
would.
a professional.
I know.
If you have more conversations with Pastor Libby, or if you have a specific conversation that you know is coming up and you want to talk through it, you're welcome to call her, or you can talk to myself, or you can talk to Pastor Stanton, and we can help you think through what those are looking like. And if you hear of people who have questions or concerns, your best response is, that's something you really should talk to Pastor Karen or Pastor Stanton about, or a member of the RIC team. Instead of saying, I'll go on your behalf and talk. We don't have those conversations because we don't put words in people's mouths. So we really encourage it. We want to talk to people. I would tell you, it is helpful. You're the one who took it off.
When you're going to have a conversation that you know is hard, or you're anticipating or have anxiety, if you want to role play that with somebody, I'm somebody that would be happy to do that, to sort of give you the practice where you would play the part of the person that you know that you're into, that's going to be trouble for you. So, and where I get to play, how would I respond to that, and what are some, and where we could just explore options. I mean, there's not just one right way. So that kind of practice and thoughtfulness, and then typically what happens is it goes way better than you thought it would. I mean, almost every freaking time. You're like, I did all that preparation for that. That's why you did the preparation. It's because you were ready. You had what you needed to enter well, and so it went well. So, yeah. There, I'm done.
Are you sure? Don't turn it off fully, because you're not going to be done. Let's pray. Holy God, we thank you for this space and this time to consider those conversations in our lives that perhaps we come to with some trepidation. Those times in our lives when we know what we want to say, but don't necessarily know how to say it. Where we know we want to be empathetic, and we want to listen, and we want to get to know people and build relationships that are meaningful, but we don't quite know how to do that without wading through stuff that makes us all feel a little icky. And so we thank you for this time and space to think about that. We thank you for Pastor Libby and for the work that she does and continues to do among your faithful people. We thank you for this place, who is so boldly entering into awkward conversations. Be with us, watch over us, guard our hearts and our minds in Christ Jesus. It's in his name that we pray. Amen. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Thank you, Pastor Libby, for being here with us. This is the last Faith Alive U for the program year, so be looking for when we start up again in October. And don't forget to come to the congregational meeting on May 21st. Worship at 9 a.m. Meeting to follow after. All confirmed.